Welcome to this edition of the B2B Engagement Podcast. I'm Gavin Finn from Canon Interactive, your host, and we're really fortunate today to have Doug Hamilton, the Regional Vice President of Lab Operations for the Midwest at Quest Diagnostics, talk to us about achieving operational excellence and scalability in a multi-site network. Doug, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks, Gavin. Great to be here with you today.
And before we get started talking about some of the issues that are facing leaders such as yourself and organizations in the life sciences industry, perhaps you can just introduce yourself a little bit to our audience, a little bit about your background, where you came from, and how you achieved the success that you've had in terms of your organizational achievements and your role today.
Sure. I have been with Quest Diagnostics for 32 years. I'm on my 33rd year with the organization. So I've been in the clinical laboratory industry for well over close to 35 years.
Mm.
Graduated with a bachelor's in biology and chemistry. Started working in the basement of a hospital laboratory at Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri, while I was going to graduate school. Thought I wanted to become a physician and actually fell in love with laboratory science. Had a pathologist there that took me under her wings and said, I think that you'd make a great laboratorian. So we just continued to pursue that and develop that. And I went to work for a small company called SmithKline Beecham Clinical Laboratories back in 1993 and worked in a variety of roles at SmithKline Beecham, but also had a long stint in the IT organization. Started out as a medical technologist back when that was the terminology that we were using. We've now moved to medical laboratory scientist, but started out in that field, spent some time in IT, and then moved back into operations in early 2000. And Quest Diagnostics bought SmithKline Beecham back in 1999. And so I became a part of the Quest Diagnostics family back in 1999. So I've been here since that time in a variety of roles. Love every minute of it. I always say that laboratory medicine, laboratory science is the best hidden gem in healthcare. 70% of medical decisions are based upon tests that a laboratory and medical laboratory science conducts each and every day. So I just love what we do. I wouldn't still be here if I didn't believe in our mission, vision, and values.
I think, as you said, everybody interacts with in various ways with laboratories in either a healthcare system or reference labs, but perhaps without even knowing that they are interacting with them. And I think that creates an opportunity for us to do a little bit of education, perhaps for most of the audience, with respect to the importance of both the science and the technology, but also the operational aspects of how labs are built, how they're designed, what the various considerations are in terms of workflow, and then operational improvements. And I would imagine that all of those aspects are dynamic in the sense that you started in this business, there's been dramatic revolutions, not just evolutions, but dramatic changes in almost every dimension
Mhm.
of what your industry has undergone.
For sure. So you think about there's the multiple elements. You have just the collection process in and of itself of getting the lab work from a patient and making that timely, efficient, but making sure that you're drawing correct samples.
Mhm.
And so labeling those, the quality aspects of labeling those to prevent any sort of handling issues. Then you have the whole transportation process of just getting the sample from wherever it was collected to the performing laboratory. And then all that's part of the pre-analytical process. And then once it arrives to the laboratory, then you have the whole analytical process of moving the samples from that accession, that point of accessioning into the laboratory. So you can have multiple handling points, you can have a single handling point. And I've seen automation, the gamut of automation coming into the laboratory as well. So driving those efficiency gains. So most definitely.
I think one of the things that's interesting is that there have been some visible effects on the improvements in technology and processes for patients. The most obvious one is the speed with which test results have been able to be delivered. And I think it used to be fairly common. I'm certainly old enough to remember a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before you got your lab results. And nowadays, those are much more rapid. So I think that all of the dimensions of the collection, all the pre-analytical, and then the actual analysis process, be it instrumentation or even reagents and chemistry, as well as the information technology that's necessary then to get that delivered. All of that has happened in various ways over the years at a fairly rapid pace, particularly probably in the last 10 years or so, with respect to delivering results that then enable not just faster diagnosis or other conclusions that the practitioners have, but probably better patient outcomes overall. And I wonder if you might speak to the thought process that goes into how you understand the role of that entire chain of events relative to patient outcomes and how that's driven by the clinical aspects of
Mhm.
the industry itself.
Sure. So I would say there's a push from the patient, the consumer, one, because with having access to information quickly and at our fingertips, now with all these electronic medical records products, a lot of times we as patients, we can see the information faster than maybe our physicians even had an opportunity to review the information. And so I think that most definitely information is flowing much faster than it ever has. I know in my particular health system that I use, they use Epic and it's my chart, and the results just flow very quickly to me. And with the high speed analyzers that are available today, results are flowing much faster. We're able to get results out much quicker. Now, that doesn't mean that every single result is available next day. There's still some results that do take much more time to complete that require that additional analysis. And so I would say the high volume tests, yes, are available much faster. But keep in mind, there is still a smaller number, a small percentage of those manual assays that are still going to take 5 to 7 to 14 days. Even if some cultures, it may
Mhm.
take 30 to 45 days to fully grow those out to go into final reports. So I want to make sure that I don't create the false expectation that everything is available next day and there's still those longer turnaround time tests. But I would say IT has been a very strong enabler of that to allow that to happen. But
Mhm.
both the patients as well as the physicians are really pushing that and demanding that. And if you think about it for that potential oncology patient who's just gotten that new diagnosis, or in some situations, a critical patient lying in the ICU that needs that fast turnaround time on the result, we have almost an ethical and a moral responsibility as healthcare providers to get those results back fast and make sure that we're driving that based upon that patient and that clinical need.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable to think about all of the different drivers that a business, a commercial business has, and all the constituents and the stakeholders. But when you think about the business that you're in and that you've been in your whole career and that Quest Diagnostics is in, there is that ethical obligation and the moral standards that you've held yourselves accountable to. And so that probably adds another layer of decision making dimension that you all have to participate in. And I think that's one of the questions that I think people are very interested in is how you have dealt with the advances in technology, rapid nature of the information revolution, and how all of these combined have created a really complex system for you and what that means in terms of the topic that we were talking about today, which is really scalability of these very large multi-site organizations. And I wonder how you think about how maybe on a daily basis or even strategically you manage complexity, because something that's fairly common in executive leaders in various industries is the world has become much more complex today. You've got technological complexity, you've got geographic complexity, so a whole variety of things. And how do you think about managing complex systems and complex worlds in your environment really being something that's become more and more important to you over time?
Mhm. Most definitely. As I begin problem solving, I like to get to the lowest level possible. So generally start out high and then think we go through the 5 whys. Why is something happening, or why do we need to do certain elements? What's really driving that? But I will also say that I have a very strong group of leaders. So it's not just me making these decisions, but I rely on my team. And I think as leaders, we have to surround ourselves with these folks that are very strong, make decisions quickly where possible because you don't always have all the information readily available at your fingertips. And so I try to surround myself with those key leaders and rely upon their skills, their expertise, and their knowledge to help provide some of those inputs. One of the things that I have found very useful is that we are using the daily management system and we call it a huddle. It's a virtual huddle because I can't be in all of my locations personally. So we do a virtual huddle. Every day, my site leaders connect with me for 15 minutes and we just get a quick rundown of decisions, maybe things that are happening in their environment that they may need support on, or gives me an update of what they're having to deal with. And I get to see some of the decisions that they're having to make. It could be instrument downtime, it could be service issues that they're having from a supplier and either not responding quickly to the request. It could be a supply chain issue, maybe a reagent or a control or something that hasn't shipped appropriately, or there could be a patient escalation. Maybe there was a sample, something wrong with a particular sample that's requiring additional attention, follow up with the physician. So those are some of the things that, maybe we have to deal with from an operational perspective, from a supply chain perspective. But then as I think about business decisions, we are all being challenged to do more with less. And so we get less reimbursement. And so as costs go up, we're getting less. And so we're having to think more strategically. Operationally, we're having to process, improve, be better tomorrow than we were today. And when you're already operating very lean, that becomes more and more challenging for organizations.
It's very interesting because you talk about process improvement and the requirement that leaders are able to synthesize data, be able to ascertain key issues, and then at a higher level of abstraction, be able to articulate their concerns to you in a way that then can be managed over large regional groups or large fragmentations of different decision units. And I think that's an interesting theme because in the past, it was possible to build an infrastructure and then to think about local optimizations around that. But if you are challenged to constantly update your efficiency in the face of very substantial changes in the broader ecosystem, the external world that you don't have control over, very often what that means is you can't design a system that's going to be in place for years and years the way you used to be, right? And this is almost a way of thinking. We have to build an infrastructure and design it for change so that it's designed to be updated. It's designed to be reorganized. It's designed to be perhaps modular in fashion. And I think that's probably true of the physical infrastructure in labs, the way that it used to be compared to the way that it is today, but also the organization itself, how you think about what's needed tomorrow versus what was needed yesterday, and how agile the whole organization needs to be.
I would say you were spot on. So I've been involved with building and redesigning labs for several years, and I just came out of a lab redesign. It was about a 3-year project.
Mm,
But when I look at the laboratory, you're exactly correct. It's an open floor plan. It's not on a concrete slab.
mm,
It's on a raised floor and in an environment that really facilitates more of a dynamic change. We know that it's not going to stay that way. And so we want to enable for the future to make it easier when we have to make those changes, knowing that they're going to come.
mm.
So I totally agree with those elements that you were just describing.
And it's true in a lot of industries, and I'm convinced it's true also with respect to your customers and your suppliers, that there are a lot of inputs that different stakeholders get to make in decisions. And so being able to have these conversations where there's an agile process and everybody gets to provide their input as opposed to maybe a serial process, which might have happened in the past, where you would talk to the scientists, then you talk to a lab planner, then you would talk to all of the instrument providers and all this in a serial process. You just don't have the time for that these days with the amount of change that's happening. So you've probably also had to rethink a lot of your internal workflows around how you get decisions made and who you ask at what point and how you collaborate around these versus that batch process almost in the
Mhm. Most definitely. And I will tell you that even we've incorporated those individuals into our daily huddle. So rather than to have to leave that call and then make 5 more calls, we have the important individuals already present at the daily huddle so that if we need to involve them in discussions or part of the decision-making process, they're already there at the table ready to engage in the dialogue.
Yeah, it's a critically important part of thinking about your own management style and what that process is as well. And it leads me back to something you said right at the beginning of our discussion here, which is a little bit of a change in path in your career trajectory based on somebody taking an interest in you. And I think that many of us have had similar experiences, or perhaps we've had the opportunity to impart that wisdom to others. What do you think is the leadership and management role in identifying talent and building up the kinds of future leaders, and how you think of not just the lab operation itself, but the organization that you're building to be able to sustain, grow, scale, optimize, improve that. So the organization is an entity as well, in addition to the physical labs and the processes. And how do you think about your role and your team's role in nurturing leaders and identifying talent?
First of all, for the front line, I believe that we are in dire need of future talent for healthcare. I
Mm,
feel like we don't have enough students that are graduating to fill the talent and the openings that we have. We're having to even recruit some of our candidates externally from the international market
mm,
just because we're not getting enough technical talent, certified talent in our local market. And to me, that's very concerning. We have started to engage at the middle school and high school level just to create the awareness about the opportunity around the medical lab scientist field as a career. Students hear about becoming a doctor and a nurse, but they don't hear about becoming a medical laboratory scientist. We have strategically partnered with schools in our local geographies to really connect with the science teachers and the counselors to really create that awareness. We want the students in our labs, we want them touring our facility to get excited about the opportunity. We provide high school internships to those that may be interested. We provide paid college internships. So we have 10 college student interns in our Kansas City lab. We have 7 in our Chicago lab, and we have 3 in our St. Louis lab. So we have 20 interns in our region that are working this summer in a paid opportunity to really get that exposure to the medical laboratory. We've been fortunate the last 3 or 4 years to have a 30% retention rate. So we're really excited about that opportunity, and we know that it's not a short term, necessarily strategic aim of what we're working on. It's a long term gain. And we know that we have to continue this to just really keep the awareness going. So we're really excited about the fruits of our labor so far, but we know we can't let the foot up on the gas. We've got to keep it going.
It's really interesting because I think there's an innovation trajectory in what you just described, and that has to do with a really long-term futuristic view. As you said, it's maybe not something that's going to impact today's labor
Mhm.
situation or operational issues, but it's certainly going to impact your ability to continue to grow and scale and operate effectively in the future. And it almost requires you to think a little bit about what functions you're going to need that you didn't need in the past. In this case, one immediately obvious one is an educational function. You're educating students, young students, in a way that was never part of sort of your corporate remit. And now you're thinking about strategically what the future is going to hold and how you can impact that. So I think that's an example of innovation that perhaps other leaders can think about relative to solving future problems based on leading indicators that you're having today. It's not necessarily something that you're trained for as a lab operations executive or manager becoming an executive, but it's something that you've identified as a key aspect of the future success of the organization.
We're also connecting with the teachers. So we found that if we can influence one teacher who may touch 100 lives in a day, the opportunity to really influence there. We had 60 educators through our facility last week on one day alone. But if you think about that over time and the opportunity, the lives that they touch daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, just in the course of their educational opportunity, So getting into the school system is definitely something that businesses need to think about if they have a need to really increase their talent pipeline recruitment.
This is an example, I think, of anticipating problems and then creating solutions today that are going to resolve those future problems. And it leads me to ask another question. I know that your lab scientists and technicians and the operations teams are involved in, sometimes out of the industry, it's not necessarily as well known, but something called laboratory developed tests, which are assays or tests that you build, that you design and test to meet a market need. That's not something that necessarily has been either an industry standard or built by a particular instrument company or assay company. And I think that there's an element probably of, when you think about technology and innovation, both the ability to react to what's happening from an innovation perspective externally, but also to lead and to be a proactive creator of innovation that might be something that the rest of the industry follows after time.
I will tell you in my laboratories and in my region, that's not something that I have as a focus. We do have certain parts of our business within Quest Diagnostics that focus more on the laboratory developed test coming out of our research and development group. And a lot of those are not in the highly automated
Mm,
test where maybe we're functioning with our in vitro diagnostics partners that go through a full FDA submission process for approval. And so a lot of those lab developed tests are done more in our esoteric laboratories because they're a little more manual in nature.
mhm,
And so in my laboratories, I really focus more on the FDA approved kit type testing because those are more plug and play. And from a regulatory perspective, it just requires some additional regulatory oversight. So, not saying that I avoid that, it's just that I don't have a need for that necessarily in my market today, but there is a need for it overall. It's just that we consolidate those from a cost perspective because they do have a little more cost associated with them, a little more costly to perform. So we make a decision to consolidate those into specific parts of our business that are in more of our esoteric labs at Quest Diagnostics.
and I appreciate hearing about that. I was thinking about LDTS as an example of proactive innovation. I think you probably have many situations where you're looking to achieve the sort of doing more with less mandate that you're given. And the answer is not in a textbook, it's not in a supplier brochure somewhere. And so I would imagine that you also have a dimension of the leadership characteristics that you imbue in your team, but also in your operational observations and goals to think about what can we innovate rather than waiting for the industry to innovate.
Sure. So whether it be an arrival profile, looking at how can we get samples into the laboratory faster to help with the turnaround time for the client. There could be patient wait times in our waiting room in some of our service centers or where maybe we have a rapid response laboratory. So we use data to help really drive our decisions. So we have a very strong analytics team. And I see that's an area that's really growing now. More and more universities are offering degree programs in analytics. And I think that those individuals can bring tremendous value to organizations by turning data into information that we can act upon, that we can really process and prove around. So that whether it's dashboards that they create for you
Mhm.
to help you give visibility into how your operation's running or just areas maybe that you need to improve overall. Those are some things that we've tried to maybe apply innovation to.
Yeah. When you think about the impact of the data and analytics, we're just collecting more and more data every day, and the amount of information is becoming potentially unwieldy in some cases, just given the volumes that you're dealing with. So I would imagine that data analytics and information systems are a critical component of your operational excellence
Mhm.
profile as well. When you think about that, one of the things you said earlier was that one of the lessons from COVID was that we could actually operate with video conferencing and we could manage remotely and do sort of some of the workflow operations in a way that we hadn't thought of as being possible in the past, or at least desirable. Were there any other lessons from the COVID era? I know you had to operate your labs during the COVID time period. In fact, they were in great demand. You had to reconfigure many of them for COVID testing and other
Mhm.
ancillary related things. What are some of the residual lessons or any residual lessons that came out of that period that sort of changed your thinking about what's possible or what we ought to be thinking about in ways that we hadn't thought about before?
I think COVID forced all of us to work in different environments maybe than we were accustomed to. And so I think it really pushed individuals outside their comfort zone. Some individuals never thought or dreamed of themselves working in the molecular department. But when the rest of the laboratory was shut down, we weren't getting samples for a lot of the other testing areas because the country was shut down and folks weren't going to the doctor. Folks were not having their routine lab tests. And so we had to move the entire laboratory. We had to get them quickly trained on the molecular techniques and making sure that they were competent to be able to perform the necessary duties. And it really forced everybody to think differently about cross training and think about just expanding skill sets. And I think it opened folks' minds to the continuous lifelong learning that's potentially possible. So I've really seen that it's helped the laboratorians to venture out a little bit more and not be so maybe black and white with their career approach. And I think in the hospital environment, the medical laboratory scientists generally operate in more of a generalist type mindset. But in the reference lab, you get, stagnant, I would say, and maybe complacent, and you're comfortable in your hematology world or your chemistry world. And COVID really forced folks to have to think outside typical
Mhm.
hematology and chemistry and move into molecular diagnostics. And so I think that was another big learning. COVID forced us to move with a sense of urgency like never before
Right.
towards resolution, towards finding solutions to problems.
Yeah, I think that's probably good lessons for people to think about. I particularly appreciate the perspective that you talked about when you were retraining folks to work in the molecular lab about thinking about their own careers and their own career potential. And I think that's a great lesson for people to think about what is possible and what skill sets and interests are transferable and generalizable as opposed to being very specific to the things they know they're doing. I think that's probably something that as you go to middle schools and high schools and you're talking to students, it's more important and relevant today than it ever was because career paths are highly dynamic these days, and partially because the nature of work is changing so fast.
Mhm.
So, what was a job with a job description 25 years ago might not even exist anymore.
Mhm.
And what we're going to need 5 years from now probably doesn't exist yet. So, being able to think about generalizable experiences and skill sets, and the most important one of which you did mention, I think, is the mindset of continuous learning and being open to identify and learn new things. And I would imagine in your organization, which is a large, very large team and group of people across multiple geographies, that continuous learning is probably a very important emphasis for you and your leaders in the team.
Most definitely. We have online learning opportunities for all of our leaders, required training, continuous improvement, continuous education.
It's astounding to think about the amount of testing that your labs do on a daily basis. And then when you think about how that had to be accelerated, particularly in the molecular side during COVID, and what's possible and what isn't possible, I think that's also a really impressive lesson for people to learn. But one of the other things that's impressive is the pure scale of your organization and the number of labs that you have. And one of the things that I think most leaders of large organizations are balancing and could certainly benefit from some of your experiences, the degree to which you standardize operations and the degree to which you deal with and allow for regional and local variations or specializations. And I wonder if you could speak to the thinking that you go through with your team about how you make those decisions. What should be standardized? What
Mhm.
is an area where individual local leaders have some flexibility and maybe develop a center of excellence in a particular way, and how you lead in that management environment?
So I would say we're certainly not perfect in this area, but we've learned a lot over the years. And from a platform perspective, some of the big things where you've got cost, you've got your people, you've got your process, you've got your technology. But on the people and the process side, we do try to standardize as much as possible. So around the instrument platforms, so we use the same platforms in all of our laboratories. That allows us to standardize on the instrumentation as well as the large costs around the supplies and the reagents. So that's a non-negotiable as far as that there's no option there. It's the standard platform and that's it. Our lab system really drives that from a reference range perspective. Then on the reporting, the reports all look the same that's provided to the clinician and the patient. That reference range is the same regardless of where you have the testing performed. It provides that consistency and that patient experience. I would say that some of the things we allow for related to variation is the management, how they manage their people. There is a daily management system and how that looks. We like to keep the structure of the data that's being presented somewhat consistent from site to site, but how they run their meetings, how they like to recognize people, their successes, their celebrations. We want them to drive that based upon their own personalities. So that's where we kind of allow for some of that local autonomy.
I think the style that you've taken, which is to let people be humans and innovators in that way, makes a great deal of sense. We're wrapping up our time, but I wanted to ask if you had any words of wisdom for up and coming leaders in the life sciences industry or any others where you would impart some potential lessons that you've learned, an aspect of your career and your personal experience that you think would be worth sharing to others who are following in your footsteps.
I think I would leave with two. So, one I learned early on in graduate school, and it's just around personal accountability.
Mm,
And it's really driven off of a book, QBQ, The Question Behind the Question, John Miller. And I think that really drives the basis for effective leaders is being accountable for to yourself, to your team, to your family, to your work, and hold up to the commitments that you make each and every day. And so that's been a must read for any of my mentees that I mentor.
mm,
And so I would just highly recommend that. The second one is taking time to really develop your leadership philosophy,
mm.
taking time to write it down, to document it. I'd been a leader for 25 years before I really was asked to take part in developing my own leadership philosophy, really thinking about it, having time to document. I would tell you it was transformational. And so, for any leader out there that's not taking time to really think about what your leadership philosophy is, you can Google it. You can think about what is a leadership philosophy. You're going to find all kinds of examples out there. I know because I did it myself when I was trying to draft mine. And if yours looks exactly like somebody else's out there, then you've done it wrong because each of our leadership philosophies should be unique and it should be our own. And so I would just encourage everyone to take the time to think about those elements that are important to you as a leader, important to you to carry on that legacy and document that, draft that, and then share it with your team, share it with your family, share it with others, and get feedback on that. And then help hold yourself accountable using that leadership philosophy.
I think that's incredibly valuable. And I want to thank you for sharing your experiences and your words of wisdom and your advice and how you've led in overcoming some of the critical obstacles and challenges and how you're innovating in your organization. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gavin.
It's been a real pleasure.